Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the overview of Azure Serverless. Before we start, I have a few quick things to go over. If you haven't already, please check in using our event check-in at aka.ms/reactor check-in with event ID 14172. By checking in, you'll receive slides to today's session, along with some links to some Learn modules, and then finally, we will also be sending out a link to the first 70 people to check in to receive free tickets to the More Serverless conference, which we will talk about a little bit more later. Please ask questions using the live chat. You should see two text boxes with the question mark over the top one. That is the live event Q&A. In the chat, I will also be sharing some links to the Reactor Meetup page and monthly newsletter if you're interested in checking out what other sessions we have. Today's session will be added to our Reactor YouTube page in 24 to 48 hours. And finally, I will share a link to our Reactor survey. If you have a few minutes, we greatly appreciate your feedback. I will now pass it over to Gwen.
Hey everyone, let me put up my screen here. Give me 1 second. There we go. Can we see the screen?
Yes.
We got it? All right, cool. Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are at. My name is Gwyneth Peña-Siguenza, but you can call me Gwen for short because I know my name is quite long. I'm a Cloud Advocate here at Microsoft, a YouTuber, and overall a big fan of serverless and of course Azure, right? And today we have a session on what I like to call an overview of Azure Serverless. My goal is at the end of the session for you not only to be able to answer the question, hey, what is serverless? People casually ask you, hey, what is serverless, right? That's a question that we get asked every day. So my goal is for you to have a solid definition so you can answer that question and also have a better understanding of the different Azure Serverless services that you can implement, the different serverless subsets that there are, and we'll cover all these things in this session. So yeah, really to kickstart your Azure Serverless journey, if you could use the chat to sort of ask questions, comments, anything really during the session, I'm going to try my best to pay attention to that. If not, we'll have time at the end to also go through these questions and comments and all those things as well. Alrighty, so let's get going. There's plenty to cover, and I don't want to run out of time. All right, so let's start with what is serverless, and we can sort of intro way into this by taking a look at what Microsoft official documentation tells us. So we know that serverless computing enables developers to build applications faster by eliminating the need for them to manage infrastructure. But let's sort of break this apart and really build like a solid understanding of what this definition is actually telling us. Now, we can start by sort of approaching the name serverless. It's sort of like two words there, serverless, right? And if you are not familiar at all with serverless, or you've never used it, or if this is something just like a word that you've heard, it might sort of lead on to believe that there's no servers here. That's not actually the truth, and this might be one of like the biggest jokes that that serverless actually has, is that servers are actually running your code. And yes, that is very true, but probably a more descriptive name would have been server maintenance list, but that's not as catchy. And this is the internet. We need those clickbaity titles. We need those things to pique the interest of people to actually delve into the tech, right? So we have serverless. But really, I guess the most important aspect of serverless is when we talk about the fact that the infrastructure provisioning and the management of the typical servers that you would use on a more traditional setup, all that you don't have to handle, and that's taken care of by the platform that you're utilizing. So it does become server maintenance less to you, and to some extent serverless, but yes, there are still servers there, right? Another misconception here is you might be familiar with FAS, functions as a service, things like Azure Functions, AWS Lambda. I believe Google has Google Cloud Functions, something like that. But yes, this is probably the most popular subset out there of functions in terms of these event-driven pieces of code that you can execute for in a serverless environment, serverless architecture. But Serverless and fast are actually two different things. There's many more subsets, and I'm going to try to cover the most popular ones in this overview, but just keep in mind that fast, serverless functions as a service, is a subset of serverless, right? So they're two different things. Serverless is not platform specific. Every single cloud platform out there has some way of implementing some sort of serverless architecture. We're going to cover a bunch of services here in terms of the Azure services, but AWS has them, GCP has them, right? It's not specific to one platform. So if someone tells you, hey, you can only do serverless on this cloud or this cloud, totally wrong, right? Okay, and in terms of what kind of things we can build with these services, you can piece together an entire application, an entire workflow, an entire app with serverless technology, or you can use it as an add-on to implement a feature to an already existing website or app or solution that you might already have. When I was getting sort of my feet wet, when I was a junior cloud engineer getting sort of my feet wet with serverless technology, I was utilizing the services to build on add-ons into existing websites that we already had. As I sort of graduated into more of building full-on solutions, I really started leveraging more and more of these services and building up larger solutions. But yeah, it doesn't mean that there's no certain percentage of services that you need to have in order to consider your solution serverless, or the entire thing doesn't have to be built with serverless services, nothing like that, right? So yeah, keep that in mind. So if we sort of piece all these bullet points together, I've come up with this definition because I didn't want to copy paste the exact thing that the documentation has told us, but feel free to use this definition I have here. So serverless is a set of services that enable you to focus on the business logic of your application, while the platform handles your infrastructure provisioning and management. Okay, so yes, let's keep this in mind, that this is the definition that we're working on. It's not a specific tool, it's not a specific service out there. It's more of like this: the management and provisioning is done by someone else. So that's basically serverless, right? Let's dive into the serverless subsets. So the most popular ones, I can't cover every single one of them because there are a bunch, and I think you might be surprised of what would actually be considered here. But let's dive into some of the most popular ones. So we have compute, things like serverless containers, serverless functions. We have workflows and integration, which is probably one of my favorite subsets, and we'll get into that a little later. And then we have database. So we have things like Azure Cosmos DB, and then we have storage. We have like your blob storage or your unstructured storage that you could utilize in a serverless way. That's in here too. I see a question here as a DevOps engineer, in which services we need to learn in Azure. If this is specific to serverless, we'll dive more into this, and I'll sort of make a note of, hey, this is something that you might, as a DevOps engineer, might want to pay more attention to. But what I will say, this is a sort of great segue into, we have sort of these most popular subsets, but we also need to keep in mind that the tools that we use for traditional setup, so things like Visual Studio Code, your monitoring apps, your Git tools, and all that kind of things can also be used for your serverless solutions. It's not like an entirely new set or different set of tools. So things that you use to implement CI/CD and all that kind of stuff that you're in charge of as a DevOps engineer, all those things can be used and fine-tuned to also work with serverless solutions, right? So let's dive into this first one, this first subset. And right now, the goal is to grab the Azure services that we can use to implement those most popular serverless subsets, right? Okay, so serverless compute, again, probably the most popular one, the most known, your AWS Lambdas, your Azure functions, your Google Cloud functions, all those kinds of things. And then this first sort of area of this subset is serverless functions. So if you have a piece of code that you want to execute in response to some sort of event, and in terms of, in the Azure Functions world, we call these events triggers. So say you want to build something that will respond in response to a file being uploaded, you could use a blob trigger, a change in a database, you could use a Cosmos DB trigger, a message in a queue, you could use a queue trigger, and there's actually a couple of different triggers that we can use to mix and match, sort of build out these pieces of code that will execute when they're called, right? So we can use Azure Functions for this, event-driven apps with Azure Functions. The next area we have here is serverless application environments. So maybe you have an application that is already built somewhere, you have it hosted on some sort of Git repo, GitHub, Azure DevOps, etc. And you want to deploy that somewhere, but you don't want to worry about hosting and worrying about figuring out the load balancing or making sure it's highly available or how you can handle the auto scaling, all those things like that. You can utilize services like Azure App Service or Azure Static Web Apps. We'll dive a little bit more into Azure Static Web Apps just because it's quite powerful actually. But yeah, these are services that will take care of your serverless application environments. That way you sort of push your code there and you make sure that any changes to your code goes there. But in terms of like, hey, I need to scale with more, there's peak in traffic or things like that, that is all handled by the platform and by these specific services here too. Now, I mentioned I did want to dive into Azure Static Web Apps a little bit more because it's a service that allows us to create sort of a static front end. So, you know, when you think of like a static front end, it's like content doesn't necessarily change as much, but the entire backend is built with, you know, serverless functions, specifically with Azure Static Web Apps. And things like the CI/CD are actually implemented for you. So there's like a template that's already built for you, and all the changes that you make in your code locally or, you know, in your development environment, all those things will get pushed depending on how you define your CI/CD pipeline. There's also things like SSL certificates, custom domains, all those kinds of things and features that are built into Azure Static Web Apps as well. A very, very fun service, I would say, and a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's pretty easy to get started and instantly have a site running, and then you can just visually see what's changing and things like that. So especially as beginners with serverless, it's one of those services that really encourages, like, you got that instant feedback. So it's quite fun to play around with. I would highly recommend you take a look at that one. And then we have serverless containers. Now, Kubernetes is all the rage. Everyone wants to know Kubernetes and learn Kubernetes and do all the things in Kubernetes. And if we could put containers inside of containers, we would totally do it, right? So the actual aspect of Azure Kubernetes services isn't necessarily serverless, but we're going to dive into an architecture in the next slide, and I can explain that there are also features within services that implement you know, certain auto-scaling and certain other features in a serverless way. So I feel like I said a lot of buzzwords here, but let's dive into the actual architecture here, and I will show you. So I've pulled a couple of these diagrams from our the Microsoft architecture page. And if you got the slides, so if you check in, you get the slides, you can actually click on that link, and it'll take you there, and it'll explain the entire thing pretty well. So I'm going to give you a brief overview here. So we have here a solution that's built with AKS. We have AKS right here. It looks like we have a .NET, a Node, and a Python stack here. Interesting stack here. But let's say this we experience a peak in traffic for whatever reason. I'm not sure. We have a product that's on sale 99% off if you use it within the next hour or something like that. And then we have a sudden peak in traffic, right? So typically what we would do is we have this AK, we have this cluster. We would take that cluster and try to use the autoscaler to sort of provision more of these VMs, right? And that can take some time, right? And if you're trying to sort of meet the demand and make sure like your solution doesn't crash, you'll need something quicker. But not only would that sort of take a few minutes perhaps, but also it's going to cost you, right? AKS has this feature that we call serverless Kubernetes, which what we're doing is we're implementing a virtual node. So when we get that peak in that traffic, this virtual node, and it's really just a slider when you're deploying, you're configuring in the portal, it's really just a slider that you implement there. And then what it does is it'll say, okay, I'm going to go to container instance and I'm going to spin up a couple of these pods to meet the demand. And the cool thing about this here is it's like quick provisioning, of course, but you're only paying for the seconds that this is actually executing. So the runtime, you pay for that. And then once it's done, once it's like the peak traffic is done, it'll scale back down and you're sort of back to your original infrastructure, right? So it's a cool way of sort of implementing, I guess, a serverless aspect with something like Kubernetes. And if you're into, you know, DevOps or you manage DevOps, you should be familiar with Kubernetes. And here's one of those tools that you could utilize, right? Next, I want to dive into workflows and integration. And I mentioned that this is one of the probably my most favorite areas or subsets in serverless, because this area really encourages us to, not only have to include the, I guess, typical engineering, like the people who code or build these solutions, but we can also incorporate like a wider range of people. Like maybe you don't have necessarily too much experience with programming or building, full stack applications, backend applications, things like that, but you're familiar with using like Power Apps or or 365 or things like that, right? So in this area, we have sort of like, well, in this subset, we have areas that will encourage like other people to like, hey, I can actually get my hands wet and actually build things that in solutions with serverless. So the first one is serverless workflow orchestration. And specifically with Azure Logic Apps. If you've never used Logic Apps, I highly, highly encourage you to go give it a try, because it's pretty fun to look at, right? Especially once you start like connecting different things. It's a visual editor. So once you start connecting these different things, you pull from here, you got the data here, you get your API here, you send this over here and things like that. It starts to become like this sort of large diagram, and you can visually see your solution, which is fantastic. But what Logic Apps allows us to do is to visually create serverless workflows that integrate APIs. If you have Azure functions that you're developing, you can integrate those in here too. If you have other SaaS products, I know there's connectors for like Outlook, there's connectors for Dropbox, there's connectors for like a whole bunch of SaaS products out there. So say you wanted to build something like someone emails you a report every week, every Friday, and that report is a Excel file. And you can have a Logic app listen to your inbox from a specific sender, from a specific words in the subject, things like that. And the Logic app's like, hey, when you get this email that matches this criteria, grab that file and then save it to blob storage, right? You can have something as simple as that. Then once it's in blob storage, you can have an Azure function that will respond to the change in the blob container and say like, hey, a file has hit, I got to grab this data, and then I have to extract this data, and then I have this data now. And then with that data, you can use an output binding in functions, and then send that to a website, to an API, to Cosmos DB, to Azure Blob Storage. There are many possibilities there too, right? But this all starts because this first area of like binding, of actually grabbing the file and saving it to where it goes, starts with Azure Logic Apps. And there's infinite possibilities. It's pretty fun and to actually build things with it. So I highly recommend you give it a shot. Let's move on to serverless API management. Now, serverless APIs you can build with Azure Functions, or even to an extent with Azure Logic Apps. But oftentimes when you have multiple APIs, multiple endpoints, and you have just like a bunch of them, it's pretty hard to keep them organized and secure and monitor. Like you don't want to have like a bunch of, like I have this function, this. So what you can do is you can grab Azure API management and you can put that in front of it, and like this is sort of manages, it secures, you can publish it, you can monitor it all from there. So instead of having to take care of just individual functions, you'll have it all in one place. The cool thing about Azure API management is there's actually an offering that was sort of built from the ground up to go with how like the nature of serverless applications. Remember, when you have your serverless infrastructure, it's not running 24/7. It's only running for, I don't know how many times a day, for minutes, things like that, right? It's not a 24/7 thing. So you wouldn't want to pay for Azure API management 24/7 if it's only really being used for the amount of times that your APIs are actually getting called. So API management has the ability to take full advantage of that there. Serverless messaging. Now, you can have a bunch of events or multiple sources, whether that be from other Azure services or external services, and you want to sort of gather all those events and do something with them. That's where Azure Event Grid comes in. And you can also have sort of this same way of working with like these events things, but more across like private and public clouds. And we can utilize Azure Service Bus with this. Now, I think I have an example in one of the following slides to sort of talk about this a little bit more. But yeah, if you messaging, take a look at Azure API management, serverless, visual serverless workflows and orchestration, take a look at Azure Logic Apps. And then for anything messaging and events related, we have Azure Event Grid and Azure Service Bus. The last subset that I wanted to cover, and I put database and storage here together just because they tend to work together when you're actually implementing these solutions. Like say you have a database, you have an e-commerce site and you have the database with the actual details of a product, but the images or videos and things like that on the specific product are saved in storage. So like they tend to work together, right? So I put them here together. Because cloud is more than code, yes. You might be familiar with Azure SQL. If you have any relational database solutions, you might already be using it, right? But typically the way SQL is implemented in a traditional setup is you have a VM, with whatever amount of cores and RAM and all that kind of stuff and storage. And you have that implemented on a server, right? And the server you'll have to patch, you'll have to make sure it's updated, you'll have to make sure, it's secure, it's scaling if you need to scale, if you need more storage, all that kind of stuff. This is bringing me back flashbacks. When I was a sysadmin, I had to deal with a lot of 2008 R2 servers. They're still around, quite a bunch of them. So anyway, but yeah, typically Azure SQL SQL is deployed on kind of that server. With Azure SQL Serverless, you have sort of like that same concept of your relational database solutions, but the cool part is you're only paying for compute used per second, right? So there's no more of that 24/7 on server, and you have to take care and pay for all that kind of stuff there. So fantastic if you're already into sort of building relational database solutions. This just might be the service for you to go take a look at. Next, if you need to also work with databases, but more of a multi-model or a non-relational solution, you can take a look at Azure Cosmos DB. Massively scalable, globally distributed, all that kind of stuff is taken care of. And I know Cosmos DB has a couple of APIs. I know they have SQL API, I believe MongoDB as well. So between both of these database services, you'll find something that you can utilize for your solution. Also, I would add that, both of these play well with other services, but Cosmos DB specifically with Azure Functions is fantastic integration. Like you have, in terms of Azure Functions, again, they're event-driven code. You have bindings and triggers and ways to get data into the function declaratively by using bindings and out of function. This is actually a nice time to mention the More Serverless conference, which is happening on the 12th, I believe. Yes, the 12th. I actually have an Azure Functions crash course, and we're going to be building something in there with Azure Functions. We're going to use an HTTP trigger, so it's going to be called via an API, via URL. And also, when we call the function, we're going to grab some data from Azure Cosmos DB, and then we're going to manipulate that data and return it right back to Cosmos DB. And that's all going to be built during that demo and that conference. And if you've checked in, you might actually win a free ticket to that conference. There's also other fantastic speakers who have a bunch of topics on serverless, and it's not just specific to Azure, it's serverless overall. Remember, I told you at the beginning that serverless isn't specific to one platform. It could be implemented any platform in a number of ways, right? So yes, make sure to check in, and then you can grab a ticket for that. And it's like a whole day of serverless content to sort of build more onto the overview I'm giving you now, right? So yeah, Cosmos DB, fantastic integration with several services, but specifically functions, right? Okay, blob storage. So now this is the storage part of this subset now. Did you know that you could host a static site on Azure Blob Storage for like pennies? If you have a site, say it's like a landing page somewhere, maybe some contact info, maybe you're a content creator and you have like you have your social media links, your YouTube, your Twitch, your GitHub, or anything really in one page. You want to have like, I don't know, gwenslinks.com, something like that. That would sort of fit the static page thing, because it's content that doesn't necessarily update often, right? It's not dynamic, right? So you can actually deploy that to Azure Blob Storage, and it'll run for make really cheap, right? But besides actually utilizing blob storage to host your static sites, you can also utilize it to store a lot, and I mean a lot, of unstructured data. And this tends to be sort of like the center of all solutions that comes to data, right? The cool thing about blob storage, like all these other services that I've mentioned, is it's all managed for you. Like you don't have a server with a bunch of hard drives that you have to log into and access to like pull a file, anything like that. Blob storage will handle that for you. You can connect to it with connection strings or keys and things like that, and depending on how you want to implement your solution, right? So yeah, a fantastic integration with all other Azure services too. I want to dive into some sort of diagrams and architectures here, but let me take a sip of water first. I've been talking a lot. Here's a great question. Could you touch on how existing applications hosted on Windows services or scheduled tasks might be migrated into a serverless architecture? Applications which are either constantly running or execute at scheduled times as opposed to trigger-driven would be the key thing here. So I think we're going to touch on this towards the pros and the cons a little bit later. So you have to like analyze how often these things are actually running, right? If it's something with like a very predictable pattern of traffic, or it's how long it's running, and it's so serverless is really like the benefits and the cost savings is like probably no traffic and then peak traffic and then back down to no traffic. I think if you have sort of like more of a steady kind of thing, you're not really going to get the cost savings or the benefits of utilizing serverless, and that might be something that can benefit from a like more traditional setup, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like serverless is great for certain things and not for other things, but we're going to touch on this in the cons, pros and cons, there's a little later, right? So if you feel like it's a predictable pattern of traffic, you might be better off keeping that in a traditional setup. But here I have a scalable e-commerce web app, and again, I mentioned this is pulling from the architecture page. If you get the slides, you can click on that link; it'll take you straight to there. So what we have here is sort of like a generic e-commerce application, and we have like a user will log into the let's think like, I don't know, gwensbookstore.com or something like that, and they're looking for a book. So it's hosted on web apps, and then they'll search for it and they find it, and the details to each item are going to be stored in the SQL database, and the actual assets, so images, videos, things like that, will be stored in blob storage and pulled from there when it's actually needed. And then the person says, okay, I want to buy this specific item, right? And then the actual order will be put into queue storage, and then we have an Azure Functions here running on a queue trigger. So whenever there's a new message in that queue, it's going to execute. So it says, hey, I got this new order. Here's the data. I'm going to send this to a third-party payment. We've left it generic here because there's a bunch of options there. Third-party payment is going to process that and tell the function back like, hey, this is done. And then that function will go over to the SQL database and then update any SOC and just make sure that you're, if we had 5 books and then they purchased 1, there's only 4 left, right? Those kind of updates and things like that. It'll also make note of the actual purchase there too. So this is a cool example of how we can utilize a serverless service in terms of as a feature or an add-on. So this whole thing isn't serverless centric. We'll have another example of that next up, right? But yeah, like say you had the whole thing built by someone else, and you needed someone to come in and build this feature, this add-on. Like this could be implemented this way, right? All right, let's move into image classification on Azure. And again, this is available on the architecture page. And there's a lot more details that you can sort of get into, more links and things in there too. This is actually more of a full-on serverless solution. You see at the middle right smack center, we have Azure Functions. And we have here is, now I'm not even thinking. The web app, so if we use the web app for this, we could actually have the entire solution be serverless because we could have it deployed on blob storage, right? So that would be pretty cool as well. So that if we sort of thought, or let's keep in mind that web app is deployed on blob storage, even though it's not in the diagram, this entire solution here is built on serverless here. So anyway, what happens is the person grabs their phone and then they, or they go to the web page or whatever it is, has a photo, and they need image classification data on this. You grab it, you take it, and then that you take the actual photo, and then the app is going to upload that, and it's going to hit an API. And that API is implemented with Azure Functions. The function says, hey, I have some sort of data. I got to grab this photo, save it onto blob storage. I'm going to save it there. Once blob storage is done, it's going to have an event grid notification. So that's this part here. And this notification is simply going to go back to Azure Functions and say, hey, I have this blob storage and it is done uploading. Cool. So the function says, great. I have this file has been uploaded. It's saved in blob storage. I know where it's uploaded. Now I need to send this off to Computer Vision API. And then I need Computer Vision API to do an analysis on this. So I'll send it over and say, hey, Computer Vision API, we have this file. It's been uploaded here. Go do your thing. The API goes and does its thing and then returns the analysis back to Functions. So Functions now has the data of like, hey, I have this analysis. I'm going to go tell Cosmos DB, hey, keep this data in there. Let's persist this data in here because we might need the records for any reason, right? And then we'll also have Functions return that API data, right? So this person who requested the analysis or uploaded the image will also get the data from the results actually in text, right? This is entirely built on serverless, right? Again, assuming that we have that deployed on blob storage here. I have a question here. How flexible are security settings when going to serverless in comparison to traditional architecture secure? So that is also, I wouldn't say one of the difficult things, but you have to keep in mind that since everything is managed by the platform, you're sort of relying more on the platform to take care of the security features and things like that. You know, you have your basics, you're covering your basics, like, you know, make sure you're implementing like a secure login, or you're utilizing Azure Active Directory, or, you know, let's keep this cloud agnostic or whatever sort of like logins features or services that you have. But you are relying on the platform to take care of the majority of it. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But it's more of like with traditional setups and you know, traditional infrastructure and solutions and things like that. We sort of rely on what we've known. And since it's been around for longer, there's like more educational material. There's more certain instructions around how to do it properly versus like serverless being more of a newer thing, right? A lot of the security does get sort of abstracted to the platform, but again, that's not like a bad thing. I wouldn't say it's the same, but I also wouldn't say serverless is insecure, right? So it's sort of like a balance there. So we can dive into pros and cons. Yeah, serverless is fantastic. I am a big fan of it, as you know. But there are good things and there are bad things, and we can dive into those. Thank you for the question, by the way, Rishabh. Fantastic. Security is always something important that we need to keep in mind. So the pros. I've been sort of stressing the pros the entire time, right? And the good stuff, let's say greater flexibility, greater scalability, more flexibility, and quicker time to release. And this is, again, because all these features, you know, the auto-scaling, the load balancing, all those kinds of things, the authentication is often included in the service that you're deploying to or you're utilizing from the ground to build your applications, right? So, you know, since you have to handle lists and you have to take less time on it, you have quicker time to release updates or full-on solutions, right? Reduce cost, since you are paying only for when the application is running. Again, traditional setups, 24/7 running infrastructure, you pay for 24/7 regardless of how much you use. In the serverless setups, you pay for when things are running. So if something runs for 10 times in a minute each time, you're only paying for that versus 24/7, right? And then fewer people, processes, and technologies required to deploy fully scalable applications. Again, because there's less to take care of, there's less people that you have to involve. So fully scalable apps, a lot quicker, less people involved. And then many services have connectors, bindings, triggers, and more ways of interacting with Azure services on Azure. I use Functions a lot for this, mainly because I'm biased, but yeah, the benefit of sort of having the platform take care of a lot of the infrastructure and the provisioning and the management of all that too is the fact that since it's natively taken care of by the platform, a lot of these other services have native ways of integrating with your solution. So if you're building something with functions, the way you can integrate it with blob storage, with Cosmos DB, or if you're using something with logic apps, event grid, SendGrid, all those kinds of things, you can implement it and integrate it. They have more native options of integrating themselves just because you have that, relying on the platform, right? And this last point is one of my favorite ones here. So it's easier for others outside of the engineering team to build solutions. I don't know if I exactly worded this, but I would like to explain it more. So like something like workflows and orchestration, you can have people who are not used to sort of coding or programming or developing things like that all the time, build these things because you don't require any code. So these things like no code and low code solutions, which fall into the serverless category, are fantastic. Like if you have like I mentioned of the report being emailed to you, and then you need to grab that data and put it somewhere, like someone who has access to the inbox, access to Azure portal, and then access to Microsoft documentation, Microsoft Learn can easily put that solution together. So the amount of people who you can incorporate in your serverless solutions and build these things out becomes wider, right? Not only do you have to worry, sort of like build teams, like smaller teams, because there's less to take care of, but also the people that you can put into the team, the people that you can rely on building solutions, that pool of people becomes wider. And that's like my experience with serverless is actually, so I was a sysadmin, so I didn't really have much programming experience. And then I was sort of tasked with automating these workflows. And then my go-to was to use logic apps and then eventually Azure Functions, because it was sort of like the less like, what was I going to learn, teach myself how to build like full stack web applications in like 2 weeks? No. So like I used like the path to least resistance and with least friction, and then it worked out for me. But yes, the cons, the not so good stuff, there is of course downsides to serverless. And I think the biggest one, and this might touch into what John was asking, where it's, you may have to develop around cold starts. So because your solutions are say idle, because you're not running all the time, the first time to execute a solution once it's idle, this latency, this lag that it's there, it's called a cold start. And if your solution is something that is timing critical, then this might be a sort of downside or a point against the serverless. If this is something that you can develop around, if that timing isn't as critical, then serverless might be for you. But again, this is probably the biggest downside to serverless. And to follow up on that, serverless architectures are not built for long-running processes. So you have something that runs for hours in the day, you're not going to see, it's going to cost you more. Absolutely. You're not going to see that the cost benefits that you get. So serverless architectures will reduce costs for applications that see inconsistent usage. So that's the key here, with peak periods alternating with times of little to no traffic, right? So it's again, no traffic and then peak and then back over to no traffic, right? If you have a large application with fairly constant, predictable workloads, then a traditional setup is absolutely going to be better for you, more of a benefit for you too. And this last one, I think this last point here is something that we can move into the pros slide at some point. I think we're getting way better at this, but debugging is just not as simple and as straightforward and as, I guess, accessible as it is for traditional setups. And a lot of this has to do with just traditional setups being around for longer than actual serverless solutions. But we're getting better at this. I know specifically for us, we have Azure Monitor, Visual Studio Code, and there's a bunch of extensions that we can use. If you're using Azure Functions, you can use the core tools and the CLI and things like that to debug. So we're getting better at this, but it's not as fluid, right? Now, I want you to sort of end this session and go get a little hands-on at least. So I've incorporated some modules here, and you can click on these with the slide decks and the links there. But depending on how in-depth you want to get to serverless, I have a sort of four 4 learning modules here. And the first one is to choose the best serverless technology for your business scenario. You might be someone who wants to just become familiar with serverless and sort of know your way around, but not necessarily build anything. Then that's the one for you. If you want to, if you're sort of like an ops person, or you don't necessarily want to get too nitty gritty in the code and that kind of stuff, build automated workflows to integrate data and apps with Azure Logic Apps. That's probably the best one for you there too. If you want to say take a step up there and actually build serverless full stack applications in Azure, that third one is for you. And then this create serverless application is sort of more of like a way longer learning path. Let me actually open up these last 2 ones, and we can take a look at the kind of content that you're going to be able to look at these paths. So give me a second. My laptop sounds like it's about to take off. All right, so this build serverless full stack applications, you're going to get hands-on with Azure SQL Database. So if you already have experience with SQL and sort of leveraging your existing expertise into something serverless, that's where serverless also shines. It's like, how can I leverage my existing expertise to build something in these architectures, right? So you have a SQL database in here. You're going to be building APIs with functions, logic apps, a lot of SQL, and then full stack and automate deployments with GitHub in there too. So that's this. Oops, let me go back here. This third one, and this last one is, I think this one's the longer one. Let me double check. I believe this one's like yes. So you have 10 modules in here, and then you have I think this one includes all of the other modules that I mentioned before, but you get to chain functions together, so you get more into the nitty-gritty of input and output bindings. You can use triggers with functions. Let's see what else we got. Oh, long-running serverless workflows. This is something I didn't mention in the Azure Functions portion, but if you have sort of long-running functions where you need to chain together these things, maybe you have a function that runs and then you need human interaction for someone to manually check off something, and then you can run the next part of an Azure function. You can utilize durable functions, which is an extension that works with functions to build sort of stateful workflows, right? So you'll get hands-on with this module. Oh, looks like I've done this one. Cool. And then you can get more into the debugging with the function core tools. You can do, if you're familiar with Visual Studio, works well with Azure Functions. There's a module on that. Oh, you can monitor GitHub events by using a webhook with Azure Functions. So any changes in your GitHub repos and things like that, you can have an Azure Function respond to those changes, and you can do, what you want with that. And Signal R. So if you want real-time interactivity, you can use that with Azure Functions as well. And this last one covers API management. So awesome. There's quite a bit there to get hands-on, but I would highly, highly encourage you to just give something a try, whether that be logic apps, whether that be functions, whether that be just, I want to be familiar more with this. Take a look at these. It's always great to sort of like get your hands wet and not just hear me talk for an hour, right? Okay, so that's pretty much the end. I want to save a few minutes to answer any questions that I might have missed, but thank you for watching. You can go ahead and send your compliments over to Made by GPS on Twitter, all the good stuff. And of course, if you have any questions, any feedback, anything like that, you can message me. I'm more than open and always happy to talk all things serverless. So we can hop into questions now. I don't know if we want to do like full camera thing because there's not much more happening on the screen, but someone linked the timer triggers with Azure Functions. Fantastic. It's a good piece of the documentation there. What is the best way to deploy and keep deployment history for Azure Functions service on Azure? Deployment history. What do you mean by deployment history? Like this is something that you want from like a CI/CD pipeline. Like I when I think deployment, I think like you definitely need to integrate your functions with some sort of pipeline. You can use DevOps, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions. You get history there. With the survey, I think we've got all. Like, how can I connect Azure Functions to Azure SQL Database? There's actually lots of. If someone could link the documentation, that'd be fantastic. But there's an API, there's SDKs that you can utilize with that. Again, your functions, depending on which language you're using, I think at the moment there's C#, F#, Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, PowerShell, Python. I said C# already, so .NET. But yeah, there are pieces of code that you can utilize, and there's some services that have bindings as well, so you can declaratively connect that too. So there's plenty of documentation out there that we could utilize. I think it's also hard to replicate service architecture locally for better debugging. Yeah, that's true. That's like one of the downsides to the actual debugging aspect of serverless is that, yeah, like how do you replicate? Like how do I get this to like run like it would in production so I can debug it locally? So yeah, Rishabh, that is a correct comment. Hi, the small feature slide is not in the shared slides we can download. Will you please send us an update? The small features slide. I'll double check that, Antonio, and to make sure that that's there. But yeah, I think we've covered all the questions there. Again, you can reach out to me on Twitter at any moment. I love talking serverless. And yeah, that's it. Any other questions? Feel free to let me know. I'm gonna take. Oh, and I hope to see a lot of you at more serverless. If you're really looking to get hands-on, especially with Azure Functions, my absolute favorite service, definitely join Jeff Noonan. Best option to deploy React-based apps. Yeah, I would say current day Azure Static web apps is probably going to be your best bet. It's because it's so easy to get started, really. So easy to scaffold everything that you need, and you just focus on the actual, building, your React components and things like that. How to run Selenium code with Azure Functions? I actually don't know that. I think there is a blog post out there. I remember Jeff Holland from the Azure Functions and Azure Static Web Apps team mentioning searing something at some point. I don't specifically know, but I know it has been done, right? I'm assuming you want to build some sort of web interactivity. Thank you. We are using TypeScript. Awesome. Thanks a lot for the talk. Awesome. All right, cool. I think we're good. I think I grabbed all the questions. And unit testing logic apps. I don't really think you can implement like the traditional way that you would implement unit testing, just because it's unit testing is more like a programming sort of paradigm kind of thing. But if you're thinking like more testing, like if we abstract like the unit part from it, we should just say testing logic apps. Right from the actual designer, I'm not sure if you've used it yet. You have the opportunity to like execute it, test your triggers, run it, and then you'll see your output and all that kind of stuff too. Do you have any suggestions for locking a static web app inside of a company's private Azure network? That is an interesting solution, or an interesting, I guess, problem to have. You could always use like VNets and then go into the nitty gritty of setting up a network and isolating your logic app, but that would your static web app, but that wouldn't be specific to the static web app. But like you could do that with really any Azure service. It's more. I guess I would question here more of like, are you sure you want to use static web apps for that? Because static web apps is mainly meant to be used as like a public facing thing. Not to say that this isn't like an appropriate way to use it, but I would encourage you to perhaps look at something like not static web apps, but the goodness, the other one, the other web hosting option that we have, app service. Yes. How to leverage security on static web apps? Well, there's authentication that you can use, of course, but I think what type of security, like which aspect of security are you trying to, like, what's the question? Is authentication? Is actually like securing the internet connectivity, or like what can get to it, what can get out of it, that kind of thing? Yeah. I think we got them all.
Yeah, I think we're good, and we are over time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gwen. This is awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will be sending out the email to the first 70 people that checked in later today. We're going to work on getting that out right now, so it should be in your inboxes in the next couple of hours. And the recording of this session, along with the slides, will also be on the Reactor YouTube channel in about 24 to 48 hours, and I will share a link to that again as well here in the chat before we end. So thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Gwen, so much. This was awesome.
Awesome. Absolute pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Everyone, bye.